exactly the same area of the brain in which the native language is acquired, and that means it's a process by which no translation is necessary. You can see this example in Switzerland, you can see this example in the Netherlands, where children are exposed to maybe 3 or 4 languages, and the results are there. We also have theories propounded by professors that you can't learn a second language until you've mastered the native language. If that were true, no child would ever speak, because they have to learn the native language before they've ever learned any language. That's the kind of nonsense that has been put out by some professors of education who simply don't know what they're talking about.
Dr. Silber, I just want to interrupt you briefly. I do need a question.
What I would like to know is how can any responsible people be so indifferent to the facts when you use Mill's method of difference and you find a differential result in the presence or the absence of bilingual education, and it favors those that have learned in the absence of bilingual education. How can anyone who is a responsible intellectual simply ignore the results of a successful examination using Mill's method of difference?
I think that's probably addressed to me, is it? If I believed that the data in California showed that programs that had adopted intensive immersion were now producing better results than programs that had retained bilingual teaching methods, I would, of course, concede that Mr. Unz had proven his point. I do not believe that. The data do not demonstrate that. The findings do not support that conclusion.
That reminds me of the
Dr. Silber, Dr. Silber. And I want to hear in the center.
Hi, sir. You talk about the fact, you talk about the reality, but do you know it's not the case in Boston? Okay? I'm talking about, the facts in Boston. For example, the Chinese bilingual and the Vietnamese bilingual students, after they go 2 almost 3 years in the bilingual education, most of them go to the advanced class in here. How do you want to explain it? And I'm the bilingual. I have a child in bilingual. After 3 years in bilingual, and right now she's in advanced class. So I want you to respond to me. What do you think about this result?
Again, I'm glad your child is doing so well. That doesn't mean that your child might not have done even better if your child hadn't been taught English immediately. Now, again, when you're looking at it, you have to look not at one example or another example, one anecdote or another anecdote, but the result across a country or the result across a state. And the evidence when you're talking about thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of students is that the students who are given bilingual education do much worse than the students who are not given bilingual education. And that really is the way general policy has to be made. With regard to your child, our initiative in Massachusetts that will be on the ballot in about a year would allow parents like you who really believe in bilingual education to apply for a waiver to place or keep your children in that program. So in other words, maybe your child is a special child who actually would benefit from bilingual education rather than be hurt by it. And if so, then you can apply for a waiver and keep your child in that program.
Okay. Now, we won't have a time for a follow-up. I want to take a question from this side. Gentlemen.
Hi, thanks. I think it's an important debate. We do it productively, and I'm not sure if we're being very productive about it. But I want to ask both the panel if you can address why is this initiative passing? If this audience seems overwhelmingly opposed to it, is educational policy for sale in Massachusetts, is it for sale around the world, and if or in the U.S., if we don't want this to happen, how can we prevent it from going through?
Well, I would say that if you don't want it to happen, or if you do want it to happen, you go to the poll and vote yes or no, depending on which way you feel.
Well, an initiative like this might be coming to your state as well. With regard to your question, I can answer it a bit. There's a very interesting dynamic which I learned about this issue during the California campaign. All the public opinion polls in California during over a year showed that it was one of the most popular initiatives in the history of California. Yet when I attended public forums or debates like this one, usually the audience was 95% against it. Sometimes it was 98%, sometimes 100%. And that's simply because the people who are most motivated to attend public forums dealing with bilingual education tend to be advocates of bilingual education, including a lot of bilingual teachers and bilingual administrators and bilingual academics. The reason this program has stayed for 30 years, even though it's never worked and been incredibly unpopular, is because it's supported by a very small but very vocal and committed group of people and opposed by the overwhelming majority of the rest of society who is home watching television. So in other words, the people who came to this forum right now believe in bilingual education. I would assume most of you based on your headbands. Well, the people who vote against bilingual education in a year's time are home watching television right now. It's not a matter of money. For example, in California, we were outspent 25 to 1 in advertising. The supporters of bilingual education spent 25 times more money in advertising than we did, but we still won in a landslide. The same thing with Arizona. And the polling numbers in Massachusetts show that support for getting rid of bilingual education is far stronger here than it ever was in California.
Can I just answer this question briefly? One of the reasons, of course, is that Ron Unz is a very good communicator, and because he presented this issue in terms that misrepresented the facts. He called the campaign English for the Children. He suggested that bilingual education is not in favor of providing English for children. If you ask any immigrant parent, do you want English for your child? Of course the answer is going to be yes. That's part of the reason, and that's part of the reason why this conversation is very important. It's necessary to make clear to the public what this issue really is.
We're going to go back on this side of the room. Yes.
I'm Maria Grace. I'm a professor in education. I'm a Hispanic. I speak 6 languages, so I have everything you don't have. I had a question, but I want to add one little thing to what Catherine just said, and that is, if only 5% of the children in Massachusetts are in need of bilingual education, the other 95% of the people in Massachusetts don't give a hoot about whether we have bilingual education or not. And that's why this kind of referendum passes, and that's why we can do this for education of the children. My point is...
A question, please.
Yeah. I want to ask a question. What you call this great experiment is not a great experiment, because 75% of the children who are eligible for bilingual education don't get it anywhere in this country. They can get it in California. How come that the tests that are given to students who enter the California university system, and they have to take a test in English, I have read that 68% of them don't pass the test. Of that 68%, 90% were Asian students who were in English-only classes for 8 years. So that's a long-term data. How can you respond to that?
Okay.
Experiment that you're passing.
If I can, I think you might have your facts a bit confused because actually, excuse me, excuse me, you're... If I can respond, it sounded like what you were saying is that the Asian students in California who had never had bilingual education were doing very badly in school. They're actually overrepresented at California universities by a huge fraction. So for example, Asian students make up about 10% of California's population, but are almost 50% of the students at the top universities. So even though maybe some Asian students aren't doing well, many of them, most of them are doing very well. In fact, they're doing as well or better than the Anglo students. And I'm not saying the only reason is because they never had bilingual education, but the fact that they're doing so well in universities and they never had bilingual education, again, I think reinforces my case that maybe one reason the Hispanic students in California are doing so badly is that they had bilingual education.